Welcome to the session on debt and development in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm Craig Burnside, chair of the Department of Economics and formerly of the World Bank, which there are several affiliations here involving the bank. We've got several distinguished speakers to talk to you today about this question or this issue. And I'll keep the introduction short, just tell you people's current affiliations. So we have Louise Fox, Chief Economist for the U.S. Agency for International Development. Ivailo Izvorsky, Practice Manager for Macroeconomics and Fiscal Management at the World Bank. Brian Pinto, my former colleague and formerly Senior Advisor at the World Bank. Albert Zufak, Chief Economist for the Africa region at the World Bank. Indermit Gill, sitting next to me, Director of DCID here at Duke and also a former colleague at the bank. And Keenan Karakula, an associate in research at the Sanford School and affiliated with DCID as well. So we're going to get started immediately. I think each of the speakers should think about taking something like 10 to 15 minutes to speak. We've discussed that in advance, and I've got some flashcards here to punish you if you roll over your time. So with that, I'll welcome up Ivailo first to speak, I think.
So we're going to talk about resource-rich Africa. And in particular, I'm going to talk about 10 countries. 10 countries that have the largest natural wealth among the all countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. These countries happen to account for about 70% of the sub-region's GDP, 70% of the sub-region's physical capital, 40% of the population, 60% of its natural capital. So it's very clear that even arithmetically, they would drive a lot of the growth in the region. But it's not just arithmetics. If these countries have deep connections with the others, if there are a lot of remittances, FDI, other investment, these countries hold the key to rejuvenating growth in the region. And if you look at what these countries are, Angola, Nigeria, South Africa, the three largest middle-income countries in the region that are on the coast, so they have direct access to markets overseas, if there is more integration between these countries and the others, they would immediately access global markets. And so this is not an accident that we focus on these countries. So I'm going to look at that through these 4 questions. And I'm asking these questions because often the way one hears the narrative about Africa is that this is a continent of unbound riches that has so much natural resources explored and unexplored, and that are driving progress, especially since the year 2000. I think the narrative could be slightly different, and I'm going to give you in a second the answer to these questions. And that difference in the narrative, in my view, would help better the countries think about their economic development and help better the others who are not necessarily resource-rich think how can they take advantage of these resource riches in the region. So I'm asking how the region has fared so far, and my answer is, well, it has fared well. It has fared better since the beginning of this century than it has since the 1960s. Nonetheless, it is lagging other regions. It has grown much less fast than East Asia, than Sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, it has grown much less fast than any other developing region. It's not converging with, for example, United States, it's not converging with advanced economies. The success in some parts, as we're going to see briefly, is due to the commodity supercycle. Commodity prices and GDP growth in these 10 countries are very highly correlated and much more over the last 5-6 years. And so therefore, making use of these natural resources, making sure that we can manage them right, I think could bring huge benefits to the region. You know, since 1960, Botswana and Mauritius have been the growth champions of the region. But even they lagged progress achieved in East Asia and South Asia. Since 2000, the progress has been focused on largely non-resource-rich economies. Rwanda, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Kenya. So the resource-rich countries of the region, even though they have grown faster than other comparators around the world, they have not grown fast to bring benefits to the region. My second question is, post that I just showed you was, well, how much is the natural capital of Africa? Where are these unbound reaches? And it turns out that there is a lot that is underground that has not been explored, that is not exploited. But what we know of the exploited riches, the agricultural land, that adds up to less in aggregate per capita and per square kilometer of area than many other developing regions. And so why is it so much in our focus? And it's so much in our focus because the other components of national wealth, physical and human capital, are so much smaller that natural capital does dominate. So Africa is very dependent on natural resources, even though it doesn't have much of them. My third question is whether natural resources have helped these countries over the last 10, 15 years. And as I'm going to show you, is yes, they have indeed. Resource-rich countries have better health indicators, better education indicators than the others. But nonetheless, these resource rents, right, the difference in what you get when you sell natural resources and the cost of extraction, these resource rents have only been marginally passed into human and physical capital, partly because of contracts with those with companies that explore them, partly because of governance issues, partly because of corruption. But these adjusted net savings, the rate with which you transform assets underground into assets above ground, has been actually very low across, with some exceptions. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit, if I have time, and let me say this before my time runs out, that the approach to a better, faster growth in Africa, higher standards of living, lies in actually four things. I'm putting two here because these are much more important. But one is extract more. There is actually scope for extracting more natural resources, using them better, introducing governance arrangements through which to use these better. What do we use them for? I think there is huge consensus that improving human capital, improving also physical capital, meaning infrastructure and others, a better business environment, and most importantly, counter-cyclical fiscal policy so it doesn't reinforce the cycles in commodity prices is one of these important pillars. But the other important pillar, without which I think this is not going to go anywhere, is this regional integration. In our work, we show that there is virtually no spillover from the resource-rich countries to the other countries in the region. Growth rates in these countries could be high, growth rates even in the neighbors would be low, or vice versa. So these spillovers have to happen. And for them to happen, the low density population is still fairly dispersed, even though Africa has 56 million inhabitant cities, more than Europe has. The thick borders, the difficulties in crossing borders to export, import, bring remittances, and so forth, and the long distance, the long economic distances need to be overcome. So let me go through this quickly. So here's the first question. Has Africa's standards of living improved? Yes, and much more in resource-rich Africa. The red line on the panel on the left, sorry, doesn't have notations. You can see, even with this little blip in the early 2000s, largely because of epidemics, you can see the years of schooling, life expectancy has increased. The poverty rates have come down. On the left, the resource-rich Africa poverty rates, $1.9 a day, the red bars. But a chart from one of Intermed's papers shows that even with these improvements in poverty, Africa actually accounts for a much larger share of the world poor now. It's actually the only developing region in the world where the number of poor actually increased from about 280 million to about 345 million. So, I mean, there's clearly much more that needs to happen. And here's the point on convergence. We look at the left charts, convergence of resource-rich Africa, and even the rest of the continent, of course, to advanced economies has stalled. We did see some hope starting from the 2000s, but over the last 5-6 years, as the commodity supercycle again waned, this has really gone nowhere. So here's Africa's natural wealth. I talked a little bit about that. If you can go one forward, please. So you see on the left the overall level of natural wealth. It has stagnated, the bottom red line. It has stagnated in Africa. You see the increase in East Asia, largely due to exploration of new natural resources and their exploitation, putting in practice, and the improved yields on agricultural land. In Africa, this has actually stagnated. There's a humongous potential. You look in per capita terms how the region has fared. When we look at comparators, many of the countries are not that well endowed. And so if you look at these large middle-income countries, South Africa, Nigeria, they don't have particularly large wealth. Actually, Gabon happens to be the most resource-rich country in Africa in per capita terms. It's 10th in the world, and definitely does change the narrative. One more, please. Now, the region, obviously, when you have natural resources, we often hear that the region has to diversify. A lot of the work that our colleagues at the World Bank do is focused on diversification. How could countries such as Sierra Leone, Liberia, Mali, Mauritania, some of the recent work on these, how can they diversify what they produce? And some of the work that we have done with Indermit Gill in diversified development, a report focused on Europe and Central Asia, emphasizes that, well, there's nothing wrong when your national wealth is dominated by natural resources. You're going to be exporting goods that are intensive in these natural resources. And so the previous slide would show you, you can download this later, would show you that resource-rich Africa, bottom, top left, exports natural resources, exports goods intensive in natural resources, very much like Eurasia does, the former Soviet Union. In the former Soviet Union, even though we still talk about diversification, there is much more understanding that this is what the structure of exports has to be. There's nothing abnormal about that, and I think this has to be the point of departure. The point of departure here. If I go forward one slide, talks about procyclical fiscal policy. You know what procyclical fiscal policy is. Government spending goes up when the economic cycle, or in the case of resource-rich economies, when commodity prices goes up. Procyclical fiscal policy means that the government is adding to the imbalances in the economy rather than smoothing the use of natural resources over the cycle. And procyclical fiscal policy is probably one of the worst things that could happen for the economy's overall health. You look at resource-rich Africa. One back, please. You see these lines going up. Huge correlation between real commodity exports and real spending. There's huge procyclicality. We can do this at a little bit finer level if we truly look at the cycle, but this procyclicality is truly sapping the health from these economies and is not creating the conditions for these economies to stand on their feet. So clearly a big area to improve. I know I don't have much time. In 9 out of 10 low-income countries around the world, there are fiscal rules that constrain what the government can do in terms of expenditures on government debt. Only 4 out of the 10 resource-rich countries in Africa do, and actually 2 of them did not use these rules effectively. The 2 large middle-income countries, Angola and Nigeria, did not use these rules effectively during the last commodity supercycle. In a way, they behaved as if there are no fiscal rules. There's a lot to be said about fiscal rules. I don't have time to talk about it here, but clearly it's linked to the effectiveness of government institutions. And without these, obviously these fiscal rules are not going to work very well. Let me skip to the end, mindful of the time. Of these of the issues of division and integration. The 3 parts. The low but increasing population density, so low density, so cities that are sparse and spread around despite that there are 1 million cities in Africa, the thick borders, the difficulties of exporting, the difficulties of moving across borders, and actually the difficulties of establishing regional value chains because of these challenges. And finally, the very modest intra-regional trade. 25% of trades of exports and imports combined of Sub-Saharan Africa is within the region, much less than other regions that have moved before it. And actually, a lot of the exports from within the region are not part of these value chains. Some of them are petrochemicals, about 3-4% of the total. The rest are final goods. Let me go. Let me go to my summary, and because I have a minute. And my summary again is that we have had very strong growth in Africa since 2000. That growth, however, has not been enough, and I think my colleagues are going to emphasize this later, has not been enough to bring convergence. Natural capital, natural resources have played a big role in the story of faster growth since 2000, but because there hasn't been genuine efforts to improve fiscal policy, especially its procyclicality, the way governments invest in education, in physical capital, and in institutions, these natural resources have not contributed to a renewal in convergence to East Asia, to South Asia, of course, also to the advanced economies. And development strategy, I think, rests not only on extracting more, investing better, improving human capital, and introducing counter-cyclical fiscal policy, but it rests on bringing genuine regional integration so that there are spillovers between the countries, so that when there's faster growth in South Africa, it actually spreads to the region beyond it, not just one or two countries next to it. And on that, let me finish. Thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions.
Well, I tell you what, the thing that I wanted to just say was that these are the results of some work that we've been doing over the last year or so, and we've completed 4 papers. And those papers, the first one is a paper on growth in Sub-Saharan Africa. The second one is a paper on debt in Sub-Saharan Africa. The third one is a paper on China and whether China is adding to debt or to growth in Africa. And the fourth paper looks at the same effects for India, right? So these are 4 papers that we've been working on over the last year. And what Kenan is trying to do, he's going to try an almost impossible thing, which is he's going to try to summarize all of this stuff in 10 slides or so, right? So he said he needed about an hour and a half to do it, but we haggled, and at the end, he's going to try to do it in 15 minutes, okay? So please give him a lot of support, because he's going to try to do something that's close to impossible. I'm going to go over there and switch the slides for you.
No worries. Thanks so much, Professor Gil. So, as an alum of DCID and MIDP program, it is a privilege to be here, come here as a speaker and talk in front of you. So I would like to thank for this opportunity, and I would like to thank to Professor Gil for creating this opportunity to write these 4 working papers. I would like to start with 3 covers of The Economist. The first cover goes back to 18 years ago, and The Economist called Africa the hopeless continent. After 11 years, in 2011, The Economist apologized and called Africa Africa Rising. And in 2013, it called Africa as Aspiring Africa. And this stimulated actually our research. What has changed? Why did economists and other scholars, development scholars, and some economists change their point of views? Actually, economists made it popular, but we can see that many of the economists and development scholars agree with this change. They already called Africa as hopeless continent, and afterwards, during the first decade of the 21st century, they started calling Africa as a growth miracle. So this stimulated our research, and we came up with 4 questions. And we wanted to focus on all the aspects of development in Africa. Because of this reason, we first focused on growth and development, and the second, whether there will be a debt crisis in Africa soon or not. And the third one is the effects of India and China. Actually, still, there is not too much work about the effects of India and China on Africa. So our third and fourth research question was about, is China helping or hurting Africa, or is India helping Africa? And to answer these 4 questions, we came up with 4 working papers. The first 3 of them was written by me and Professor Gil, and the fourth one was, India one was written by 3 Indians, Professor Gil, Siddharth Dikshit and Chimnoy Kumar. Actually, to tell the truth, I was expecting more Africans in here, but I cannot see too many Africans. So it is a little bit surprising, but we will continue our presentation. So, as Professor Gill mentioned, it is very difficult to summarize all 4 papers, but we want you to leave here with 10 takeaways from these 4 working papers. Actually, there are more takeaways from the papers, but these 10 takeaways are the most important one or the most eminent one which we would like to put emphasis on. Next slide, please. The first one, we examined whether there is growth miracle in Africa or not. And the result is that actually there is no growth miracle in Africa. But why economists and development scholars call Africa as growth miracle? Because of low expectations. They expect Africa to perform at this level, not at the level of East Asia and South Asia. Because of this reason, we came up to the conclusion that actually from the per capita GDP growth rates and growth rates of Africa, we see that there is no significant signs that Africa is actually outperforming other regions. Actually, next slide, please. In 1960, an average African was richer than South Asian, and an average African was equally had same income with average East Asian. However, what happened? As we can see, the gap between East Asian and African increased significantly, and an average South Asian caught up an average African in 2016, and in 2017 now an average African is the poorest one. So this is not growth miracle. We cannot call this growth miracle. And if we look at this red line, we don't see any indicator of the growth miracle. Actually, there is growth miracle, but on the opposite side. There is growth miracle on South Asia side and East Asia side, but not in Africa side. And this growth miracle popular motto stems from low expectations, and Africa was held back with low expectations. Our second main important point is that Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola, these 3 largest countries are very important for Africa and Africa's future, because altogether these 3 countries are making up almost 60% of continent's GDP. Of course, there are some other countries like Ethiopia, Senegal, and Kenya. They are Rwanda actually. They are growing fast. But these countries can be an example that how can they overcome the development problems, but they cannot be an engineer, or they cannot push the region forward by themselves. This task should be done by these 3 countries, because these countries are very important for the future of the continent. And unfortunately, these countries are not doing well. Actually, they are doing very bad. As we can see from the growth charts, they are underperforming their peers. They are underperforming the countries in their region, and they are underperforming. In the last 3 years, they experienced negative per capita growth, and the forecasts are negative for the next 3 to 4 years. So, with this low growth rates, these countries cannot push forward the region. For example, Rwanda is growing, Ethiopia is growing, but these countries are small countries which contribute to the region's GDP less than 3%. What is disheartening for us is that these countries are showing attributes of low-income countries. This is disheartening because these countries cannot change this easily. So the attributes cannot change easily. Because of this reason, these countries should overperform the other regions and other countries in the next future. As we see from education, one of the main pillars of development, all 3 countries or largest income countries are almost showing low-income countries attributes. And even in secondary school enrollment, secondary school pupil-to-teacher ratio rates, these all 3 countries, largest middle-income countries of Africa, are underperforming the low-income countries. Likewise, life expectancy and health indicators. All three countries are underperforming even low-income countries. And one of the important pillars, another important pillars of development is electricity. Without electricity, a factory cannot be operated. A school cannot provide proper education. You cannot provide proper health services in hospitals if you do not provide enough access to electricity. Because of this reason, these three pillars, these development pillars are important, and Africa, and particularly these three largest middle-income countries, are underperforming even low-income countries, and they are showing attributes of low-income economies. And what is needed? Actually, the most important thing for us, education, electricity, and domestic revenue mobilization. Education is important because, as William Easterly said, no country has become rich with universally unskilled population. Education is at the top of, at the heart of all development problems. Same with electricity. And Africa's youth population is growing significantly. And by 2040, number of youth in Africa will exceed number of youth in South Asia and East Asia. And if the trend goes, by 2100, there will be as many as youth in Africa as the rest of the world. Because of this reason, education is important. For some reports, this is an advantage for the Africa. Yes, I totally agree that this is an advantage, but if you provide enough skills to these youth people, if you do not provide enough education, enough skills, then this will become a danger for your future. And electricity, as president of African Development Bank said, Africa is tired being in the dark, and under the dark, Africa cannot develop. There are about 600 million people who do not have access to electricity in Africa, and the rest of the world is 350 million. Today, Germany and France are generating more electricity than one continent. And on this continent, 1.1 billion people live. So, and electricity, if these countries cannot provide proper electricity, cannot secure their electricity and energy, then we cannot talk about rising Africa or aspiring Africa. And another important one is domestic revenue mobilization. The OECD average is 34% tax to GDP ratio, but only 6 countries in subcontinent, out of 48 countries, their tax to GDP ratios are over 25%. Like one of the largest middle-income countries, Nigeria, its tax to GDP ratio is 1.5%. Domestic revenue mobilization is important because it reduces the dependency on aid. It creates ownership, and it creates fiscal space for development expenditures. Because of this reason, these 3 areas are very important. Whether Africa is going into another debt crisis or not, Africa received debt relief after the 2000. And as you can see, the map turned to green. And the debt levels, both external debt and public debt, came to sustainable levels. However, we analyzed that whether these levels are sustainable or not. The outcome is these countries are borrowing irresponsibly, and the map turned to red again. Particularly after 2012, these countries started borrowing commercially and issued bonds, and this creates problem. Based on just that levels, we are seeing that in the near future, these countries may experience the problem. But what is important is that dynamics matter more than that levels. That dynamics cause countries, allow countries to pay their debt or cannot pay the debt. For example, think about 2 countries. Their debt to GDP levels are around like let's say that 40%, but one country is generating primary surpluses, growing fast, and another country is generating primary deficits. It is obvious that their that this stress is not same. Because of this reason, debt levels matter more than debt dynamics. And in the next slide, we will show that how this perception changed. Actually, in our paper, we came up with 4 scenarios. And in the first one, we show just the absolute debt levels. And based on these debt levels, the largest countries of Sub-Saharan Africa are not in trouble. The shaded countries are the countries which have which are which constitutes the five top economies of the continent. Actually, this is a little bit complicated, but we see from this one just absolute debt levels. Based on just absolute debt levels, we see that the big countries, the big economies are not in trouble. But if we include the change in the debt and primary surplus or deficit or the interest rate growth differential, we see that how largest countries, largest economies of the continent came to the stage. And this is just relative order, but we see that Angola, South Africa, Sudan, Nigeria, all largest countries of Africa could be in trouble in the near future. Next, please. And last 2-3 points are about China and India. Actually, China is one of the most active development partners of Africa right now, particularly after 2008. China has been contributing to Africa a lot. And the question is that whether China is hurting or helping Africa. And we didn't do econometric work, but based on some econometric works, actually China's contribution to the subcontinent is positive. But what we did is that Africa is starving transportation, Africa is starving electricity, and China's development finance goes to these areas, transportation, electricity. Actually, it doesn't, China's finance is not a big burden for the African governments. These countries are the 10 countries which receive the Chinese aid at top. Zimbabwe, Angola, Ghana, etc. And as we can see from the shares, actually China's debt or China's finance is not a big burden for almost 8 countries. It might be a burden for Zimbabwe and Angola, but for other countries, actually, the worrying thing is commercial debt of these countries, not development finance from China. And our last point, people are very skeptic about India's involvement in Africa, but India has become the second largest trading partner of Africa after China. And for example, France, Germany, and even United Kingdom and United States fell behind of India in terms of trading with Africa. And we would like to share one more specific graph. Next slide, please. Actually, one of the increasing products among exports from India to Africa is pharmaceutical and medicine. And actually, India is providing almost 80% of ARV medicines, which is used for the treatment of HIV. So this is all I would like to say. I am aware of that I exceeded a little bit time limit, but I had to summarize the 4 papers in 15 minutes. My apologies for this one. All the 4 papers are available at the conference website. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you all for coming. As you will soon see, they saved the best for last in this session. That was supposed to be a joke, by the way. Okay. In terms of the presentations. So yesterday there was a lot of very interesting discussion on the IMF, the World Bank, and other multilateral development banks. And the discussion focused a lot, I would say, on the political economy, how these could be spheres of influence dominated by various countries, and how important they are, the proliferation of different MDBs, is there learning, is there accountability, etc. there was one thing that was not mentioned either in Homi's presentation at the start or in the session on multilateralism. And that's something I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation, which is that the IMF and the World Bank in particular, but the multilateral development banks, are extremely influential in the analytical frameworks that are used. So they are banks not just of money and influence, but also of ideas, and they shape the way we think about these countries and the way policies are formulated and the way the donors react to these countries or interact with them or the way they design their aid. So this is something I'm going to be focusing on. So the presentation draws upon two papers. One is a critique of the 2017 version of the low-income country debt sustainability framework that is being implemented even as we speak. It started this July. Now, this is something that the World Bank and the IMF, which have done it together, which they describe as a significant overhaul, but in fact, it's obsolete. Now, that's one paper. The other paper is an example from Ethiopia, which asks the question, what should the government of Ethiopia be doing now that it has been downgraded to high risk of debt distress by the IMF and the World Bank in the last DSA, Debt Sustainability Analysis, which they did in January this year. So what should they do? And in fact, this paper is a particularly cogent illustration of the obsolescence of the LIC DSF. Now, in case you're wondering, these papers have been shared with the World Bank and the IMF at the highest levels. I'm not holding my breath. As a former chief economist for the World Bank and a mentor of mine said, a good strategy is to ignore even well-founded criticism and it eventually goes away. So that's the world that we live in. By the way, unlike Chalar, I can no longer be fired from the World Bank because I've already left. So. Duke CID, if you're looking for someone, I'm available. So now, by the way, I was struggling a bit with the language to use on these slides. So I wanted to say conflict, but the word conflict in Africa is already loaded. There are many conflict and fragile and conflict-afflicted or affected states. So I didn't want to use the word conflict. The other, of course, is that when you have a conflict, you need reconciliation, and there are lots of truth and reconciliation commissions in Africa. But clearly, the title of the presentation is Reconciling Debt Sustainability and Development. So when you talk about reconciliation, that presupposes a conflict, not an insurmountable conflict, but a conflict that could be addressed. And this conflict or clash between debt sustainability and development in Africa has two aspects. The first is that the investment needs for the SDGs, if you're going to meet them, are vast and immediate. Now, so even if you have the best governed country in Sub-Saharan Africa, if you actually try to remedy the electricity shortage, if you try to eliminate extreme poverty, if you want to create jobs for the youth bulge, rather than have them cross the Mediterranean in boats that are extremely fragile, etc. You've got to invest, and the government has to invest. So no matter how well managed you are economically, if your governance is of the highest order, you're going to have a debt sustainability problem because public debt is going to go up, current account deficits are going to blow out, and you're going to have a debt sustainability problem. The other part of it is that initial conditions are not good. In fact, there is a consensus that the next debt crisis has already begun in Sub-Saharan Africa. And there's a lot of information which you'll find in the two papers that I have there, some of it from the IMF itself, that public debt in particular, both in terms of its levels and dynamics, and of course, Keenan and Indermeet's work support this, that public debt, both in its levels and dynamics, poses a serious threat already. So this brings us immediately to why the LIC DSF, the 2017 version, which is now being rolled out, why it's obsolete. It's obsolete because it continues to focus on debt distress in relation to one component of total public debt, namely public and publicly guaranteed external debt. In other words, the official component of external debt. It does not look at domestic public debt, which has grown remarkably in volume, domestic treasury bills being issued. It looks, of course, at Eurobonds, but it does not, but it excludes domestic public debt. So that's one. So it doesn't focus on the right variable. The second is that we know from the accumulated experience in emerging markets and developing economies that that typically, the typical situation is one of unsustainable public finances spilling over into current account deficits and external debt. So if you focus on external debt distress, and that too just one component of it, you are focusing on the symptom rather than the malady. And so this itself is a powerful reason for altering the framework. In fact, this was recognized when the IMF and the World Bank held a consultation during the spring meetings in 2016 about the revisions to the debt sustainability framework. But eventually, what they produced was just a tweaked version of the original framework. And not only that, they made this obsolete framework very sophisticated. And you know, the IMF itself admits that there are serious public debt data problems in Africa. You've got all this hidden debt, etc. So you have data problems, and you have a lot of macroeconomic uncertainty about Africa in terms of measurements, lots of the variables, etc. So whenever you have this sort of thing, these circumstances, it's easy to see that simpler methods could be more robust than more sophisticated methods. So very simple approaches to public debt sustainability analysis. The second reason that the framework is obsolete is that it focuses on the present value of debt. Now, this made sense when concessional external debt accounted for the bulk of public debt in Sub-Saharan Africa, which was the case before the HIPC and MDRI debt write-off. Because at that point, it was concessional, right? So you could take a discount rate of 5% and say the true debt burden is the present value of this concessional external debt, which would typically carry an interest rate much lower than 5%, and you get the present value of that debt. But now it doesn't make sense because there are many different types of debt. You know, there's a profusion of different types of debt. You have bilateral concessional debt, you have multilateral concessional debt, then you have bilateral non-concessional debt, you have multilateral non-concessional debt, you have Eurobonds, you have hidden loans, you have countries like Chad borrowing from Glencore, you've got all sorts of things. You've got domestic treasury bills, and these are at market rates. In fact, at the margin, the market is defining the marginal cost of borrowing for sub-Saharan African countries. This means that if you focus on the present value of debt, you don't really get an insight into the debt dynamics. When I tell you that public debt dynamics are unsustainable, you'd say, okay, you start thinking in terms of the three basic variables that drive public debt dynamics: primary fiscal deficits, the real interest rate on government debt, and the growth rate, right? But when you're looking at the present value of the debt and how you project it in relation to certain thresholds that you derive based on historical analysis, you really can't interpret R minus G, because what R do you use? Do you use 5%? And I would argue that given the profusion of these different types of debt, it makes much more sense to look at nominal debt and look at the actual interest rate that you're paying on this debt in relation to growth. And that gives you a better idea of what the debt dynamics are. The two problems are: one, that you focus only on a subset of total public debt; two, you retain an antiquated focus on the present value of debt rather than its nominal value. So there are four obstacles to resolving this clash. The clash arises because, one, you already have a public debt problem, and two, you continue to have vast investment needs, right? So you have a problem both with the initial conditions and how you square this issue of having even more public spending to remedy the lack of human capital, of electricity, etc., creating jobs. And so you have this obvious clash. So there are four obstacles to resolving this clash. The first is, I think, given all these different narratives we've had on Africa, the failed continent, Africa rising, Africa aspiring, it's time to say that it's time for Africa to take charge of its own destiny. And you see this very clearly when you visit these countries. There's a very strong constituency for reform. The leadership, unfortunately, is not the best. Economic governance is not the best. And I give an example there of Rwanda, which is the star performer. Its CPIA is 4 out of 6. That's the country policy and institutional assessment ranking. And its credit rating is 5 levels below investment grade. It has a very high current account deficit, and that's in part driven by the vast infrastructure investment needs that they need today, which creates these problems. The second is an attitudinal problem. There's simply a failure to accept that 10 years after the HIPC MDRI debt write-off, we do not have a strong foundation either for public debt sustainability or for long-run growth. Ivailo made this very interesting presentation on the natural resource-rich countries. What I found in my work, over the last 2.5 years, and traveling to many countries, is that the natural resource curse is alive and well in Africa. So it's not just Dutch disease. It's not just a question of booming commodity prices and agriculture and manufacturing declining on account of that. It's that natural resource wealth is used to enrich the well-connected few. This is the case in Mozambique, Angola, etc. So it's a rather serious problem. The third is, of course, that the development financing needs remain vast and immediate while ODA is shrinking. This also is there in the IMF's report on the macroeconomic prospects for low-income developing countries that was released in March this year, right? And the fourth is there does not seem to be much appetite for change, either in the IMF, the World Bank, or among the donors. So if you have this combination, these are serious obstacles to resolving the clash. So what then is the approach to resolving this conflict? First of all, if you have vast investment needs and ODA is shrinking, and governments at the margin are borrowing on commercial terms from the market at 10% in Eurobonds, etc., this means you've got to revisit both the pricing and allocation of aid. And the allocation of aid in an intertemporal sense, if you have upfront investment needs, is there some way of front-loading that ODA without increasing the fiscal burden on donors because of their own political problems, their own economic problems at home? And the only way, and we do suggest a way of doing that. And one way of doing that is to take a small fraction of the grants now going to Africa, which is about $45 billion a year. Let's say you set $5 billion aside. Then at the prevailing interest rate on the 30-year US Treasury bond, you could raise $100 billion upfront. But then there's another problem, which is that there's serious concern about the misuse of public resources in Africa. So you need to have a much tougher policy dialogue. You need to have the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank, and donors speaking with one voice. But what I discovered in my work, once again, that rather than having this collaboration, you have a combination of what I would call competition, condescension, and you can imagine in which direction the condescension flows, and turf-mindedness. So that's not going to help you very much. Now, I wanted to talk about the Ethiopia case study. It looks as though I have only 1 minute left. Let me just say this, that the IMF downgraded the IMF and the World Bank to high risk of debt distress in January last year, based on the fact that the debt service to exports, and here debt service on public and publicly guaranteed debt to exports, exceeded its threshold under the LIC DSF. Now, this is a liquidity indicator. This is an international liquidity indicator. But if you look at Ethiopia's numbers, it's very clear that the current account deficits and external debt dynamics have been driven by vast investments in infrastructure. So the causality very much flows from high fiscal deficits to external debt dynamics. So the question really to ask, but surprisingly, the DSA says, don't worry about public debt. stays below its threshold. It does stay below its threshold, but when you look at it more carefully, you see that that's because real interest rates on public debt are massively negative because of a combination of financial repression, namely issuing local currency debt at highly negative real interest rates. And the way you do that is you have capital controls, so you can't have money leaving the country. And the second is that you have highly overvalued real exchange rates, both of which make public debt dynamics look good but are bad for growth, especially at a time when the government's strategy under the Growth and Transformation Pact is to transfer growth from the public sector to the private sector. You're not going to get FDI and private sector coming in if you have financial repression and overvalued real exchange rates. So Ethiopia is an example of where the crucial questions are not being asked. And neither of them is either raised in the IMF, World Bank, DSA, or in the broader policy analysis. And this is not going to be remedied by the 2017 version of the LIC DSF. So thank you for your attention, and I just think that you have, in addition to the evidence that's presented on the problems in Africa, you have a serious problem because there is little appetite for changing the way ODA is priced and allocated, or how the policy dialogue is conducted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Indemit, and great to be here this morning. I came on that 1:30 a.m. flight last night, so I would have to beg your indulgence if I don't sound as coherent as I would like to be. Anyway, but first, let me say, when I was invited, I thought I was going to academia, so I dropped my tie. But to my surprise, everybody here wears a tie. So seems like you guys have become bureaucrats, and I'm trying to get back to academia. So, look, it's very, very difficult to comment on this very, very interesting work, and it's a very, very deep analytical work that has been done and presented here, at a very fast pace. So I'll try to do the same. I'll try to go extremely fast in providing what I would see as cross-cutting comments, because most of this work I have actually seen it or even review it. The Vilo's work I've reviewed it I don't know how many times now. So let me probably make 5 points here. And first, echoing Kenan's point, yes, I'm kind of disappointed too that there are not that many Africans or African-looking people around here. I know you're all African by heart. But I think it's important to have a diversity in views when we are discussing Africa. I mean, I cannot help but noticing that all of us here speaking have some affiliation with the World Bank or are still, like myself, working for the World Bank. I think it's important to get, a diverse set of views. From academia, it's important to have African students working on Africa, Africans in academia, non-Africans really from academia, really projecting different views, because honestly, most of the things I've been hearing here this morning is what I've been hearing for 20 years plus at the World Bank. So I've been scratching my head, tell me something I don't know. Sorry guys, not much. So let's really step back and talk about these Africa growth stories. Yes, the Economist, I read the Economist until the Africa section and I skip it, okay? So it's a great, great paper until it comes to Africa. So they have completely lost credibility when it comes to Africa from my perspective. So in the mid, starting with the Economist yo-yo, it's, we're used to it, right? So look, the growth stories in Africa is actually very, very simple. And I tend to agree with Kenan's presentation. We tend to have set so low a bar for Africa that anything we see is, celebrated or overemphasized, or when it's negative, it's overemphasized as well. So, and that would apply to the looming debt crisis, or as I've read, the already booming debt crisis. I think the real story of Africa's growth, from my perspective, is the whole Africa Rising story was a GDP growth story. But when you switch to a GDP per capita story, there is no story. Because there's one extremely important mega trend in Africa that we tend to forget, is the demographics. You have a 2.6 average population growth rate that we rarely account for when we are doing analysis when it comes to Africa. So when you take those resource-rich countries, and plot your per capita growth, it's not that impressive. It's way, way below what we have seen in Southeast Asia. And I used to work for years in Southeast Asia, actually. It's nothing close to what we have seen there. So I think it is important to account for the demographics when we are discussing growth in Africa, and we probably have a very, very different story. The second thing is the elasticity of, the growth elasticity of poverty, which I haven't heard discussing this morning. You may have high growth rates in resource-rich countries, but those rates do not necessarily translate into poverty reduction. They do not necessarily translate into concrete development outcomes. Take a country like Republic of Congo, one of the highest per capita GDP in Africa, but it has one of the poorest health outcomes in the developing world. So, we need to really look at that ratio of, that elasticity from growth to poverty or from growth to development, which was completely different in Southeast Asia. And this certainly has to do with the structure of growth, the composition of growth. In Sub-Saharan Africa, most of the growth has been commodity-driven, has been resource-driven, which are essentially capital-intensive sectors and have not been creating jobs. And that term, to my view, is what we need to be focusing a little bit more on. How do we create productive jobs in Africa should be the focus of all the development economics analysis going on. How do we create productive jobs? It's not that Africans are not working. Most of Africans are working and working extremely hard in the informal sector. And they work in very low productivity activities. How do we move these economies to a stage where they can actually create more productive jobs? To my view, is the most important question we should be addressing here. Second, the next point I would like to make is one thing I didn't hear that much is the environment. And when you look at resources, I think that's something that probably we should discuss further. When you say one of your recommendations is extract more, how do you account for the looming carbon transition? When you project forward, how is the fossil economy looking like? Right? If you are an exporter of hydrocarbons, how does it look like when by 2100, probably the demand for all these, fossil fuels may drop considerably, if not, really significantly. So there is that aspect of, the transition, the carbon transition, but there is also a positive aspect to that, which is with the digital revolution and the need to build batteries for solar, there is a new wave of minerals that are actually going to become more valuable, right? And how do we position countries to actually manage that potential next boom, from my perspective, is extremely important. Now, next point is fragility. I think Brian mentioned the prevalence of conflict. And one very sobering number is that 72% of Africa's poor live in fragile countries. Fragile situations are countries where, you have open conflict, violence, and most of it is in the Sahel. And I think that's extremely important. There are hotspots in Africa, and by the way, Sub-Saharan Africa alone is 48 countries. So there's a very, very dangerous tendency to depict Africa as a country. And frankly, this may be a very, very basic point, but it's actually very, very important. And that applies to growth as well, because 3 countries make 60% of Africa's GDP. The rest of Africa is actually growing at above 5.5% as we speak. But the average is pulled down by Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola, which have been in recessions. Countries like Ghana, Ethiopia, Rwanda are still growing at above 7% per year. And that is extremely important. It is fundamental to know that, even when it comes to fragility, you have spots, hotspots, just like you have in every other region in the world. But you have the Sahel, you have the Horn of Africa, you have the Great Lakes, and I think it's important to link fragility to poverty and fragility to resources, because some of these fragile countries are actually also resource-rich countries. Now, on debt, let me say that the real issue here is how to help Africa borrow without sorrow. And it's important that we all agree that Africa needs resources to finance its infrastructure. And I think it has to be a starting point. I mean, all the alarm bells on Africa's debt seem to be missing the point that ODA is declining. Overall, development assistance is declining. And just to give you a few numbers, 2 years ago, we had the largest IDA replenishment at the World Bank, $75 billion, of which $45 billion are going to Africa for the next 3 years. If you believe the African Development Bank estimates of the infrastructure gap in Africa is more than $90 billion per year. So the whole IDA, if it was invested in Africa in a single year, just on infrastructure, it wouldn't even cut half of it. So it is important for the development community to actually realize that, ODA is no longer enough to finance infrastructure, and Africa, just like any other continent in the world, needs to build its infrastructure, needs power, needs, roads in order to trade and grow, and then create the jobs that are needed. So it is important, frankly, to, insist on addressing the issue of infrastructure finance in a more comprehensive way. I think focusing on just the level of growth that is, the level of debt that is growing, from my perspective, is a little bit of a distraction. The more fundamental point on debt is the change in composition of debt that Brian alluded to. And debt has become less driven by official development assistance, debt. It's more private, it's more, market-led, it's more domestic, and those changes need to be accounted for when we are doing those debt discussions. So, on that point, I hate to agree with Brian on most of the things he said. Yeah, I hate to agree with him because, we used to actually, quarrel quite. I was hoping to have that opportunity here again, Brian, but I hate to agree with most of the things he said. Because that framework on assessing debt is really, really, problematic, to be polite. It's problematic. And one thing that is certainly confusing is liquidity versus, solvency. And I think, in the Ethiopia case, we clearly see, an issue of liquidity due to large investment in infrastructure. And for those of you who have been to Addis Ababa, this is a case where you cannot actually question that debt was used for investment in assets that would prepare the country for growth in the future. If you visit Addis Ababa, you will definitely see that, it's just a time inconsistency problem. And that's why at the World Bank, some of us have actually pushed back, and we have just 2 weeks ago passed a development policy loan to Ethiopia of $1.2 billion. We had to fight all the way up to make sure that loans comes to solve that liquidity problem that would hopefully bridge the gap between infrastructure investment and the return in terms of growth and development. So Let me just close here by mentioning China. Again, China, I'm glad you guys are coming to a result that would also balance the views on China, because I cannot tell you how many hours I spend explaining to especially the Europeans on our board what we're doing with China. Why is China in Africa? Well, because you left Africa. So, and Africa is, China is actually stepping in and closing that infrastructure gap. Is it problem free? No, there are a lot of governance issues. So was the case for, bilateral aid for other countries. We need to all address that issue of governance. And since my time is up, let me just say, we need to, step back and say what is actually really good for Africans, not African governments. What is really good for Africans? And I think it's three things. It's human capital. And we need to all work to help those countries invest in human capital, in education, in health, in nutrition, in ensuring that the next generation of Africans is not only educated, but healthy and productive. The second thing is to focus on leveraging innovation, riding the digital, economy to actually create jobs in Africa. I believe, and my office has produced a book last year on leapfrogging in Africa, right? And I strongly encourage you to visit the website of the Chief Economist Office in the Africa region. If you want to hear read more about Africa's macro prospects, better than in the MIT's papers, please download this publication and please read it. You'll have all the discussions on Africa's prospects. Last. Oh, well, okay, thank you, Idemit, thank you. And last point, I know I've said last many times already, but last and very last point, Brian said something in his paper, and I actually like it. He said, concessionality cannot compensate for poor economic management or poor economic governance. And I think that's a fundamental point. We're all focusing on those debt as, a financial discussion. It's about, the pricing. It's about, China. But it's mostly about how countries are equipped to formulate and implement the right economic policies, and how they actually select and implement the right investment projects. And for that, for most of our countries, the lack of coordination at the top, the lack of prioritization at the top is glaringly missing. It's glaring. And my office has actually launched an initiative. It's called Chief Economists of Governments. We've launched a knowledge platform called Think Africa Partnership. And what it's doing is to equip the chief economic advisors to presidents and to head of governments in Africa with the teams, with the tools, and with a platform, a network for peer learning. And for the first time, we are going to meet in Oxford University in February with all the chief economic advisors so that they can actually form that network and start helping each other and using the right tools to advise our governments. On this, thank you so much.
Hi, sorry that DCA Reagan National Airport didn't cooperate yesterday in trying to get me to North Carolina. I did spend enough time there that I should have been in North Carolina, but I never left Washington, so I apologize. But I'm really glad that I'm able to join this session remotely because it's really a pleasure to discuss these three papers, one on Africa's resource-rich countries, one on Africa's middle-income countries, and Brian on evaluating debt sustainability. On Africa's resource-rich countries, I guess I sort of thought a bit about what's new. We know that economic policy is worse and economic poverty outcomes are worse. What do we do? And I have to say, I was a little disappointed that the presentation ignored the political economy aspect, which, good for him, Albert put front and center in his comments. And I think that the elites in many of those countries are much more interested in the prices of the goods that they're importing and their vacations in London, Lisbon, and Paris, and London. And so they have, bad fiscal policies, overvalued exchange rates, etc. And I think, first of all, they could learn from the Middle East countries that social compacts can break down. But second of all, I think we all in the donor world really need to push on transparency, because these countries can only grow inclusively and become more self-reliant when they have more transparency. And that's, of course, what EITI project is about and trying to achieve. My own agency is also doing programming around that in these resource-rich countries. And I would say we don't think resource-rich countries in Africa are forever cursed, but we certainly do see these governance challenges. And I think we need to have a much broader discussion about the political economy of them. And that leads me to Intermit's paper, where Intermit and Keenan. Good on Keenan that he gave up on the airport and drove down yesterday and made a long drive, and good for him. Looks like you arrived in great shape. So I think on that paper, on the question of whether Africa's missed the bus, well, first of all, I'd say relative to East Asia, almost every developing country missed the bus, for sure. And I sometimes feel like comparing Africa to Asia is really kind of unfair, because, Africa was a complete subsistence economy, and then along came colonization, which was much more extractive than colonization, to the extent it existed, was in most parts of Asia, especially East Asia. And I think post-independence African countries have struggled to build mostly from scratch these economic and political institutions that they need to design and implement an effective economic agenda. And again, Albert, kudos that the World Bank is trying to develop a cadre to work on that. But I just think we need to be patient. It takes time for states to learn to be developmental states. And citizens have to learn better performance. And just calling on more education, I don't think it'll do the trick. It didn't do the trick in MENA either. And if you recall, the education level in, say, Thailand or Vietnam or even Korea at the time in 1970, if you go back, wasn't that high. So I think we need to focus more on the fact that Africa is trying to speed up history, and that's really hard. Now, having said that, Africa is not a continent, and performance has been mixed. And, we already talked about the resource-rich countries. So to pick 3 resource-rich countries and say because they're not doing so well, Africa's not doing so well, is kind of insulting to the countries that are doing well. And I really don't think that when China wasn't doing well, Thailand would have liked to hear that they have no chance of doing well just because China wasn't doing well. So I think that there are countries that are doing well. We can talk about Rwanda and Ethiopia were mentioned. We can talk about Kenya. We can even talk about Ghana, although that has some serious macroeconomic issues. And FDI is up in these countries, and that's transforming technology. So there are a number of bright spots that we do need to focus on, I think. You can tell I have African in my heart, even if I'm not an African. But I had also jotted down the issue of population growth and the problem of the denominator when we go to growth in per capita income. I think for a long time, the World Bank ignored it. Many donors ignore it. And by the way, when you go to Oxford in February, Alfred, and you meet with those economic advisors, please bring that issue up, because it's endogenous to economic growth. And you won't be able to have a job strategy until the rate of growth of the labor force declines. And I think, by the way, Ethiopia, Rwanda are countries where fertility is going down. Kenya and Ghana are countries where fertility has gone down. But, you know, although Kenya and Ghana have brought fertilities down to about 4 children per woman is the most recent from the DHS, they still have way too many young women marrying below the age of, and having their first child below the age of 18, which means they're going to be more fertile. And it's not just, it is, yes, about contraception and reproductive health services, but it's also about addressing this problem seriously, addressing the norms, addressing the laws, etc. Now, let me turn to Brian's paper. Brian, you had 2 papers, very thoughtful. I didn't expect anything less than very thoughtful. My experience with you when we were at the World Bank is if Brian has an idea, I'd better start paying attention. And that's true here. And so I agree on the importance of the twin deficits and that more attention could be paid to them. My impression is that for middle-income countries, the rating agencies do pay more attention to them. But the real problem is the countries that are not in that market don't get rated. And so there is also that information gap. I also think it's helpful that you pointed out the 2 opposite causes of debt distress. Excessive borrowing to fund needed high priority investments. I mean, and of course that goes back to Mr. Chenery, Professor Chenery, and his original 2-gap model, which was driving World Bank economic thinking, 60 years ago. There is a savings gap, no question about it. And that is an issue if you're trying to develop. But the second, of course, is the misuse of public funds. I might add that I would expect the latter to be expected. Poor countries in Africa, as I just said, have underdeveloped political and administrative structures. It might be helpful, given this reality, as Brian suggests, to have more oversight from the IMF and the MDBs. But I have to say there's a mixed and long history there. Both of not giving the best advice and of countries disregarding the IMF and the World Bank advice and warnings when they get it. And, Brian also talks about bilateral ODA in this area. And I have to say, since coming to work for my own government, I'm certainly reminded once again that bilateral ODA has multiple objectives: strategic, humanitarian, values-based, and economic. And so I'm not sure bilateral ODA is actually the tool to use there. And also, it's not necessarily a good idea to only have sticks against countries borrowing too much, especially after the fact. Now, but you can only be after the fact if you're dealing with Mozambique and they hid their debt. What can you say? And from that point of view, I have to say, the U.S. government and its interactions on the debt sustainability framework and other issues has always called for more transparency from lenders and borrowers about debt. And of course, that's because the U.S. government and other donors learned the hard way through HIPC about the importance of this transparency. I mean, that was one of the big outcomes of HIPC, is we've got to be more transparent. And I would say newer players in this bilateral sovereign debt scene maybe don't quite understand that history. And I think that the lack of transparency is part of what is making some of this current debt issue difficult. Having said that, I just saw some data from Nancy Lee of the Center for Global Development that actually a lot of countries, low-income countries, poor countries, have made progress on tax revenues as a share of GDP. And there were some promises made at Addis on trying to throw more light on where stolen money is being laundered and hidden to allow more revenues to come into the Treasury. And I don't know if Brian has a comment on whether he thinks anything positive is coming out of these areas, but I do know that my own government, USAID, as well as is working with the IMF and a lot of other donors to build up this DRM and the PFM systems. But it's going to be a bit of a long haul. And on Ethiopia, I thought your paper was really interesting, Brian, for two reasons. First of all, the question of whether the profile of the sovereign debt financing infrastructure matches the return, the expected returns. And I guess that's why the World Bank has always had the benefit of extending debt maturity. That was the card that the World Bank could play. That was what it offered over commercial debt. And I think the question, that question about debt and the maturity versus the benefits of the infrastructure is one that ought to be sitting much more front and center in some of these international discussions. And you know, I would say that Ethiopia thinks it's taking charge of its own history by contracting a lot of this sovereign debt. So it's doing, Albert, what you say countries should do. The question is, what are the consequences? But I also think the fiscal consequences of the reforms that many are suggesting to the Ethiopians, bilateral and multilateral donors are suggesting to the Ethiopians, which, Brian, you highlight in your paper. You didn't discuss in your presentation, but you highlight in your paper. I mean, that goes back to why IMF and World Bank budget financing was considered important. However, the terms of IMF financing are not long enough, given the fiscal effects that you highlight in that paper and that you're well known for highlighting in other cases. And I think that's also an issue which is worthy of further discussion. So we don't make the same kind of mistakes we made in the 80s and the 90s, pushing reforms that had such a long payoff and created such a downward spiral before they finally paid off. Many of the structural adjustment reforms have been paying off in Africa over the last 15 years, but my God, that was a long payoff. And so we certainly don't want to, as we look to what to do about countries that are getting in debt and yet have strong development needs and have weaker institutions, we need to make sure, I think, that's my personal view, this is not a U.S. government view, we need to make sure not to repeat the problems the mistakes that we made before. And I'd love to hear Brian's comments on that, perhaps as well as Albert's. Okay, thanks a lot.
All right, so now we have time for some questions. I think the way I'm going to try and organize this is to take several questions in a row, and we'll finish up the session with answers to the audience questions, as well as sort of remarks that the authors may have for the comments on their work. So let me start with the gentleman over here.
Thanks. Good morning. Thanks to the panelists, and especially I like the comments of the commentators. My name is Gary Gireffi. I direct the Global Value Chains Center here at Duke. And what I liked about the comments, the commentators, is pushing this idea of looking for some fresh thinking and ideas with regard to Africa. So I want to raise 3 points that all deal with the papers that Keenan and Indermit wrote, but it spills over to others as other papers as well. One has to do with this discussion of differences in regional growth patterns between Sub-Saharan Africa and other regions of the world. I think the problem when you do Sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia or even South Asia is you've got such a big difference in the sectoral distribution of GDP or exports. So Sub-Saharan Africa is dominated, as various people have said, by commodity exports. East Asia is dominated by manufactured exports. South Asia also has a lot of manufactured exports. And the only lower performer than Sub-Saharan Africa was Latin America, also dominated by commodity exports. So you have two regions that are commodity export-based, resource-rich, two other regions that are manufacturing based. So what happens when we bring in those sectoral dynamics? And when you look inside Africa, the countries that seem to be doing particularly well, countries like Kenya, Rwanda, Ghana, South Africa, Ethiopia, are either emphasizing manufacturing exports as a part of their economic profile, or they're focusing on processing natural resource-based industries and adding more manufacturing. So point one, I don't think the regions themselves are capturing the underlying dynamic of sectoral distribution of GDP or exports. Second is this question of China, which is very important. I really agree with the people that emphasize that Africa needs major infrastructure investments. That's an important part of a growth path, and China is providing those. But the China Belt Road Initiative, which is touching 68 different countries, has actually already got a lot of pushback from countries for various regions. China itself has been relabeling Belt Road Initiative and a recent conference at Duke Quinchan that I was attending last month as socially and environmentally responsive outward foreign direct investment. So I think China is aware of the fact that other countries receiving these massive investments and loans are beginning to say, how does China's investment match up with our development needs and our own development strategies? And some problems are emerging. I mean, China wants to be environmentally responsive, but the big railroad that they built between Nairobi and Mombasa cut through one of Kenya's key natural resource parks, and there was no thought given initially to how do you remedy that problem if you're going to bisect what's considered a key natural resource. Recently, Sri Lanka was unable to repay the debt on a port over a 10-year period, and China then said, okay, since you can't repay, then we can take control of that port. And so this is raising a big issue. Many of those countries in Belt Road Initiative are quite poor. The loans that China is making are quite large. So the question is, what would be the appropriate way to negotiate with China investors in terms of what the relevant development strategies might be, or the needs in Sub-Saharan Africa, in order to get a more responsive sort of investment behavior? And I think a key thing would be to look at other regions of the world that have done that. Latin America, over a century, has dealt with resource investments from different Western countries, US primarily, but Canada, Europe, et cetera. And they've got an experience of trying to negotiate over time better terms in terms of how those resource investments could fit local needs. So I wonder if there's any thinking about examples of how African countries either are trying to renegotiate or might think about a bargaining position, because China really is in the court of public opinion in terms of its political economy strategy. It realizes if it's going to be a major investor in so many countries around the world, it's going to have to develop some way of respecting or being responsive to those needs. So I think that would be a fruitful area to explore. Final point, I think this issue, one thing that hasn't been mentioned at all, except in a couple of the comments, was the role of services, and in particular the digital economy. Instead of painting Africa as just a gloomy picture, also be good to say what are some of the key innovations that have been occurring in Africa. So if you look, for example, at mobile money in Kenya and M-Pesa, it's a leader in the world. It's been one of the most effective economies. It could be called leapfrogging, but there's also a lot of innovation occurring there. A few years ago, Rockefeller Foundation had a conference in Nairobi on the 10 major agricultural innovations in Sub-Saharan Africa over the last 50 years. Oxfam America and my center at Duke worked with Rockefeller in sort of helping document those. So a key question would be, if you go to those 10 innovations, how could they be scaled up? In other words, or final point, tourism. I mean, I said services, I think, could be a growth pole. A lot of the East African countries in particular have been focusing on resource-based tourism or safari tourism, and it's got a lot of pros and cons and some advantages, but part of that has driven regional integration. The East African countries are saying, can we have common visa policies in order to attract people coming in? So part of this issue of institutional fragmentation maybe could be addressed if we look at some of these sectors, like services, that are trying to bring some of the regions together. So let me stop there with those comments.
Thank you. I'm a first-year student at Sanford. So I think sometimes the discussions here are had as if the people on the other side, on the recipient side of the spectrum, are not thinking adults. So we talk about relationships with Africa, carrot and stick, as if it's a child that we should punish or reward if they do a good or bad thing. So how do we reflect on the relationships between the lenders and the borrowers so that we foster better relationships between those two parties and have more productive outcomes? Thank you.
I have a question following a little bit from the last point, which is just about how good are these tools, the debt sustainability tools, at kind of capturing quite a few different things that they're trying to achieve at the same time. So the one question is, are they trying to genuinely assess debt sustainability issues, or are they also trying to guide domestic, internal to the fund and World Bank policy? So I think the fact that they're trying to guide policy as well as actually capture the real causes of debt sustainability problems is sort of a conflict. So to the degree that some of those problems are arising from volatile capital flows, or the issues that were raised in the first by Vilo's presentation, sort of commodity supercycle issues leading to fluctuating earnings, how well are those tools able to capture those kinds of new dynamics? Is it a case of trying to create tools that do capture that? And the second question was, the second point that I wanted to raise was linking to calls for new thinking that Mr. Zouafak mentioned. I'm sure you're aware that the high-level expert meeting at UNCTAD the other day on financing for development sort of raised the issue of trying to mandate UNCTAD to actually pursue alternative strategies to capturing sustainability issues. And another kind of issue is the political economy questions that were talked about in multilateralism yesterday, which was actually that the G77 are actually trying to push for broader strategies, trying to kind of look at this more unequal balance of power in the whole creditors-debtors dilemmas, basically by looking at the responsibility of lenders as well as borrowers in the whole thing, and trying to institutionalize the principles that the UN has kind of tried to pursue. So I'm just wondering if there are any reflections on those kinds of issues. Thanks.
I'm Eric Wibbles of the Political Science Department here at Duke. I guess I want to echo Albert in it really struck me how much of the discussion was very macro about fiscal stance and debt dynamics and et cetera. And that a lot of the opportunities and challenges strike me as being very much about sort of frontline services, sort of last mile services. Issues of demographics are ultimately very micro issues bearing on household decision making. So, I get the really big question is how to what's the relative weight of macro versus micro considerations in terms of thinking about the opportunities and challenges of development in the region. But that would generate big sprawling answers. A different way to put this is, given an ODA pool of X, what % do you think ought to be spent on sort of last mile services versus these big macro considerations?
I'm Godi. I heard the Democratic Republic of Congo mentioned once. So my question is for all of you there, a lot of African countries are struggling, and only few really benefits. But Congo is, again, it's one of the richest countries in Africa in terms of minerals. And it's also now is the poorest country in the world. So how do you, as the African countries, how do you really talk about the social justice, about all the issues, the conflict, especially the benefits the Western, the cobalt, coltan. It's really bringing chaos in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Children are being forced to mine these natural resources, and women are being raped. And how do you really study about this, the conflict? And my personal experience, based on the colonial mentalities, a lot of the African leaders, they adopted ways of every aid that comes from international
it will go to the big government, and it goes to their own pocket. It never, never, never goes reach to the poor people where all these people are living in poverty. It doesn't help them. You guys are big players out there, but instead of focusing on people, and most of the funding it goes to the corrupted government, and how do you balance that? Is there any really studies, effort on that? Thank you very much.
I think we'll try to address some of those questions. So I'll just kind of work my way down the table and let
Can I ask
let
a
people
question?
respond.
Sorry, she gave me the mic. Thank you. I'm Phyllis Pomerantz. I'm another escapee from the bank. If you look at the aid profiles from OECD donors over the last 20 years, they in fact have been in Africa predominantly financing human capital investments. And despite the pleas of African governments, have never actually financed much infrastructure except in the last few years. So the question is not so much the amount as the quality of investment and what efforts are being done to actually steer investments to the more productive sectors. I mean, I agree with Louise that I don't think at this point education is the issue.
Questions now. So,
sorry. Okay, I'll just take a quick shot at 2 or 3 of the questions. The first one was the question from Maria. The thought that occurred to me, Maria, was that we've always thought about Africa as a low-income region that depends on high-income countries. And I think that what has actually happened is that Africa has changed completely, and now Africa, it has become almost a group of middle-income countries that are interdependent with other middle-income countries, right? And we need to sort of switch our thinking, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing was in terms of the questions that Gary asked, and in terms of the comments from Louise and so on, that she didn't like the fact that we were talking about just the largest countries, and that is insulting to the other countries and so on. That's a good point, and it's true that Rwanda and Senegal and Botswana and others are doing well, or have been doing well for a while, and they can form good examples, just like Hong Kong and Singapore and Taiwan were good examples, okay? They were good examples in East Asia. Sri Lanka for a while was a good example in South Asia, but they were never engines, okay? So we are talking about engines of growth and development. And for those, you have to look at Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, Sudan, Kenya, and maybe Ethiopia down the line. So it turns out these are the largest 5 middle-income economies. They're close to 70% of the GDP of the region. And regardless of how you do the math, if they don't do well, the region is not going to do well. And they have lots of interdependencies and so on. So one of the things that we did in the paper that Kenan and I did was that we actually looked to see how important are the large middle-income countries in each of the world regions. And you should look at that paper and you actually find that they are very important. Okay? So it doesn't mean that Chile won't do well. It just means that Latin America won't do well unless Brazil and Mexico and perhaps Argentina do well. Okay? So that's one thing. And, you know, go back to the example of East Asia. Well, East Asia in part did well because Japan, which was a large economy, Japan was doing well. And then when Japan started to slow down, China took over. There was always a large country that actually did well and helped all the other countries do well. That was one thing. The second thing was this issue about the problem of the denominator that Albert raised and that Louise raised and so on in terms of the population growth and so on. Right? So one of the things that actually struck me was that when you look at World Development Reports from 1980 and 1990, especially 1970s and 80s and so on, all the reports, they would talk about family planning programs. And somewhere down the line, what happened was that we stopped talking about them, right? There are some countries in Africa that actually do implement very good family planning thing. Rwanda did, Ethiopia did, and so on, right? And it turns out that those countries actually effected a pretty quick demographic transition, right? But we generally don't talk about family planning programs in a continent where population growth has remained very high. And there's lots of analysis about this in terms of whether or not African fertility patterns are actually unique and so on. There is a whole lot of work by a person called, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, his name is Bungatz, right? Okay. But the thing is, when I asked Ngozi, I said, why is it that these planning programs, these family planning programs do not seem to be popular in the region? And she said that Africans are skeptical of Westerners telling them to have fewer kids. Okay? She said it's a sparsely populated continent, right? It's not a continent thing. And then when you look at India and China and you see how much attention that they are getting, and it's because they have large populations. So I actually go back to the point, and I disagree with Phyllis and with Louise. I think education is hugely important because you're not going to be able to affect a sustainable population transition without having educated women, right? So that's one thing. Now, in terms of this thing that, we are talking about the bad things, and so on. No, actually, we do talk about the good things in the papers that we do. I think that we've emphasized the bad things because negative messages tend to get much more attention, right? But the positive things like M-Pesa and so on, they've got a lot of attention too, Gary. In fact, they probably got too much attention because you focus on these micro interventions and so on, and you say this is really good, but you still have to look at those aggregate numbers. And they don't look particularly good, right? So I think that was part of the reason why I think. I'll shut up.
So just quick on a couple of the points. Do I have to push something? Yeah, just a couple of the points. I mean, one of them was that we cannot compare East Asia because it's manufacturing based with Africa's resource base. Well, actually, I think it's very relevant because you tend to produce goods or services that are intensive in the factors that you have most. When East Asia had cheap labor, it exported largely goods that were cheap labor intensive. Now actually it has switched in one of my slides. Now it produces capital intensive goods because it has built capital, much more capital than it had before. So East Asia, like the former Soviet Union, probably perhaps some of the parts of LAC, have a lot of natural resources. I think that's what they're going to be producing. We're not looking here for comparisons to make somebody look bad or good. We're looking here for good examples. What could we learn from this? And so, and part of that is actually to say, look, there's nothing wrong. I mean, there's nothing bad about Africa producing and exporting natural resources. That's what we have. That's what we use. This is a lot of money. Recently, I was reviewing some work that was saying that a resource-rich country in the continent has to get rid of its dependence on oil. Well, the best way to get rid of its dependence on oil is stop producing it. Would the country be better off? Surely not, given the huge needs for education, which I also think is very, very, very important. This, similar to in the midst points, we're not looking at the mathematics of how, when we have some countries growing fast, some slow, how does this average? We're looking at spillovers. We looked at our paper at whether there are spillovers from the large middle-income countries, from the 3 resource countries to the rest of the continent. Yes, there could be a lot of informal trade. There could be a lot of other informality that is not allowing to capture very well these spillovers. That's probably true. Looking at the published data, we don't see any of these spillovers, and that's why we're thinking if these countries do very well, and they do well on the policy of using natural resources, on integrating with their neighbors, giving an example now with the new continental free trade area, not to be an example similar to LAC that's blocked access to the rest of the world, largely to protect the internal market. I think these countries can bring a lot of dynamism to the region that already has spots of fabulous dynamism. Luis made a comment that, well, it's all about political economy. Of course, all of these things are about governments and the political economy. How can governments use better these natural resources to invest in education? How can Africa spend 4% of GDP on education on average, as Korea spent less than 3% in the early 70s and in the 60s, and achieve so relatively bad results? So what can we learn? how can we do better with fiscal policy? I mean, there are valuable lessons around the world that we have counter-cyclical fiscal policy, so we don't emphasize the swing of commodity prices, and so we have at least that element to control this volatility, which definitely affects regions that are export dependent. You ask also, sorry, maybe not you, sir, about the macro and the micro, and I think the way we think, Gary, sorry, yeah. Eric, sorry, yeah.
50-50 is the answer.
Yeah, well, or without good macro, nothing else would happen. And so countries that do not have good macro, I think one has to invest in bringing that to par. We've seen around the world that countries tend to learn, and once they have good macro, they sometimes slip back in their old ways, but usually they tend to maintain that good macro. So once you have the good macro, you can put all your efforts into micro policies. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for comments and questions and presentations. I have a few comments. Let's start with Gary's comments. The composition of GDP and the economies. Yes, you are right. It might not be correct to compare these countries, but we are comparing these countries to examine which development episodes East Asian countries and South Asian countries experienced. And there are some works by Dio, Macmillan, Hartgen in 2015, 2013, etc. All these studies put emphasis on some sub-Saharan African countries actually started to experience the change as structural adjustment, structural change. First of all, their primary sectors constitute a significant amount of their GDP composition. But when we look at the East Asian and South Asian countries, in 1960, when we can compare, they also started from this composition. And we are comparing these countries to whether African countries are getting some examples, getting some benefits of the experiences of South Asian and East Asian countries. In 1960, there were more poor people in South Asia and East Asia than Africa. 50% of the poor lived in East Asia in 1960, but now 50% of the poor live in Africa. So, we are comparing to see that whether African countries are experiencing the same stages. Actually, the econometric works prove that some of the African countries during the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s, they started experiencing the same structural change. And this allowed this country to be called as growth miracle. And another thing, I totally disagree with you, Filius, because education is at the heart of all development problems. This is why we are here. This is why we came to US, right? And as we showed from our graph that there is an increasing number of youth in Africa. And if you cannot provide enough skills, sufficient skills to these young people, then it turns out to be a disaster for this continent. Because of this reason, education is important. And these countries, even largest economies, largest middle-income countries in Africa, they have low-income countries' education attributes, health attributes. If this trend goes on, I am sorry, but I am very hopeless about the continent. So this trend should change, and because of this reason, electricity and education, they are at the top of all development problems. And the third one is, we are some economists like Stephen Radelet, they are hopeful about the continent. But as I mentioned already, the expectations are low. For example, 2015 book of Stephen Radelet claims that Africa is introducing some like mobile banking or M-Pesa. Kenya is introducing M-Pesa, and there are more like people who are dealing with some IT. But look at India. India is a pioneer country in IT because they are providing enough education to their people, their youth. If Africa cannot provide enough education to their youth, then how can Africa get benefit of these small developments? So right now, this is what I can say. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And by the way, I should first of all thank Indermeet and the Duke CID for giving me a chance to talk about the LIC DSF and coming back here after 19 years. The last time I was here was in 1999, talking about the Russian crisis of 1998. So there's been a whole bunch of questions. First on Ethiopia, something that Albert said, and Louise also said. I don't think that Ethiopia has established that it has. It's clear that it has a liquidity problem, but the government needs to establish that it does not have a solvency problem. There are lots of questions about the Addis to Djibouti railway, about the light rail, the other projects. And I think the government needs to do the analysis it can to demonstrate that these projects are going to increase future growth and taxes, ensuring solvency. And this needs to be done. Unfortunately, this question is not raised by the World Bank and the IMF. In fact, the DSA gives a very optimistic assessment of the payoffs to these projects without providing any evidence. And this is something that it needs to do. So it misses the boat completely. It focuses on external debt distress, completely ignores the fiscal solvency issue. More work is needed there. Louise made the point that there are very long lags. Indeed, India demonstrates that, Vietnam demonstrates that, Kenya, when it started reforming in the early 90s, after the Cold War ended and the US no longer needed Mombasa to park the 7th Fleet, and suddenly the donors cracked down on corruption grounds. It really reformed, but it took, in all these cases, it takes 10, 15 years. That's the sort of lag you're talking about between implementing reforms and seeing the benefits. So the fiscal costs are incurred up front, but it takes a long time for you to see the benefits. And this is where the long maturities in debt become extremely important. And Louise is quite right that the IMF financing is simply not geared for this sort of, these long lags. Then there was a bunch of questions raised about how about incentives for more productive outcomes. Don't treat the African governments like spoiled children. How good is the LIC DSF tool? What about the last mile issues, etc.? All these are connected. And let me just say that I think some of this was already discussed. When you see the picture of any minister in India on the front page of the Financial Times, it's not the Minister for Health or Education or Women's Affairs, or Rural Development, although all these are crucial. It's usually the Minister of Finance carrying his briefcase into Parliament for the budget discussions. And the point is this, that focusing on this kind of macro is not bad, because we all talk about the importance of governance, leadership, and institutions. So where do these get reflected? First and foremost in the way the public finances are managed. How you use natural resource wealth. Do you use it to further development and help the next generation, or to enrich the well-connected few? So if you don't manage that, if you don't get the public finances right, you're not going to be dealing with the last mile issues. Who's going to care about them? You just don't have the environment, the right kinds of incentives. The other thing is, when I was doing this work, I was working a lot with the AFDB, and I always thought that, okay, the AFDB is African. It is on the continent. The fact is that there are very serious political economy challenges in Africa. The countries with the lowest CPIA scores are largely natural resource rich, and they are fragile. So what's happening? So I thought, okay, the AFDB, unlike the World Bank and the IMF, which are located in Washington, D.C., are on the continent. And there's that old saying that you can tell ethnic jokes if you belong to that ethnicity, otherwise you better be careful. So the Africans in the African Development Bank should be raising the tough issues, the political economy issues. But they don't do it. It just isn't happening, and that's one of the things that needs to be remedied. Now, how good is the LIC DSF tool? Not very good at all. In fact, it's obsolete. Unfortunately, I couldn't present everything, but the two papers that I refer to are, on the app. So please do take a look at them. Let's see, was there anything else? Yeah, I'm fed up of M-Pesa, to tell you the truth. And the reason is the following. The reason is that it's one thing if you have M-Pesa together with a very good domestic financial system. But when they become substitutes, that's not good. I mean, we need the basics in Africa where people want to invest in local currency assets, but most of the time they don't. Kenya introduced interest rates on deposits, on borrowing, right? They introduced interest rate controls. So the whole point is that when you have an innovation that's trying to circumvent something that you should have done, that bothers me. If you do it, as a complement to good institutions, then that's great. So, I'm not as impressed with M-Pesa as some of the people here seem to be.
To draw this to a close.
So let me stop.
Thank you very much. It's always refreshing to be back in academia, and with the caveat, Craig made earlier, these are my views, not the World Bank views, so I feel liberated to be a little bit iconoclastic, right? Let's come back on demographics. I raised the point. But again, immediately we fell in the low expectation for Africa. We all did in this discussion. When I raised the demographic issue, it was about, demographic, dividend. It was about population actually reducing per capita growth. Two ways to look at it. You could say, well, why can you grow faster? But what have we done here in this discussion? We all focus on why, and the only way is to cut fertility rates. Do we actually believe some African countries can actually grow at double digit? I do. Why can't we focus the discussion on there? Take South Africa, one of the largest economies, second largest economy on the continent. If you look at fertility rates in Africa, they are now close to replacement rate of the population. So it's a non-issue. Fertility is a non-issue in South Africa. It's 2.5, the fertility rate. How much more can you cut it? Can you actually work to make South Africa grow at 8, 10%? It's possible. Why can't we focus on it? Again, it seems like we don't all believe that Africa can actually make the same type of growth rates that East Asia did. And the instinct is to go to the negative, is to go and cut back and reduce. And so again, yes, fertility is an issue in the Sahel, certainly. And, but we could actually really work all together in pushing higher growth rates that would also raise per capita growth. Second issue of diversification, and Gary, you talk about global value chain, and just for a little advanced speech here, the next WDR 2020 for the World Bank is going to be on global value chains and trade. And in my team, we have actually started working on industrialization for jobs, taking that approach of integrating regional and global value chain, and I'll definitely want to discuss further with you. But one thing I've not been very, very pleased with is this idea, and you see it in the Africa Vision 2063, that diversification means industrialization, and it means low-wage, low-skill manufacturing the way Southeast Asia or China did it. I've had long discussions with Justin Lin, who's been the main proponent of that theory and argument, and on November 28th, I'm sharing a panel with him again in Ethiopia, and I'm sure we're going to clash again. But I don't think we can just restrict Africa to just copying and reproducing what happened 20, 50 years ago in Southeast Asia or 30 years ago in China. With the digital revolution, I think we have the opportunity to rethink a new development path for Africa. I think, unlike Brian, I actually see in PESA the foundation for that new digital economy on which we can actually build to really create jobs if we can scale it up. And I think we should be wondering, why did that happen in Kenya and why is not happening in neighboring countries? What can we do for that to actually happen? So my sense is, when it comes to diversification, yes, we do need diversification. We need to create productive jobs in Africa, but we probably need to take a portfolio approach. In some countries, you have the best bet is to invest in agro-industry, adding value to some of these products and just serving the domestic market. If you just look at the import bill for food for Africa, it's a couple of $1 billion per year. Look at the impact on the fiscal side. Basic investment could actually be extremely beneficial. So it could be agro-processing. It could even be resources, which is something we have not been discussing that much. Technology is actually allowing miniaturization of equipment in extractives. And if we think hard, if we really start looking into it, natural resources could actually be one way of diversifying and probably in downstream create more jobs than the current extraction model does. So I think we should probably get those ideas on the table instead of just saying we should just copy what Southeast Asia did. China. Oh, almost. Okay. One more point on China. Huh. One more thing on China. Gary, I think I probably don't share that view that China needs to prove whatever they have to do. I don't know between China and Glencore who is actually hurting Africa more. But nobody is talking that much about it. Glencore is practicing predatory lending. It's clear extortion from my perspective. Look at what happened in Chad. Why is it that we're not talking about it? At least China is building roads and they're leaving something behind. What is Glencore doing? I think we should be fair and really start thinking of what is good for Africans one more time. And let me stop there. I can talk a little bit more about most of these things. Thank you.
I don't know, does Louise have anything to add? Or I think we need...
I'll just add a few quick comments because I think you're probably running over.
Yes.
So I just want to say that when we're analyzing a situation, yes, Albert, we need to get away from old models that didn't help us, but we also need to have the right variables. And frankly, it's true that the large intermediate and Keenan, that the large countries in Africa will drag down the African average if they don't grow. That's a arithmetic fact. But that doesn't mean that the complexity and diversity within Africa doesn't matter. And so just as I agree with Albert about whatever the cover of The Economist is about Africa, that's my view about the analysis of whether Africa's missed the boat. Now, I didn't say that education didn't matter. What I said was it by itself will not solve the problem, and I will point to the Middle East where they have a highly educated population and they're still not growing because of the political economy. However, what I will also say is that Africa, so Keenan, study the Middle East and then see if you still think that's the key variable. But what I will say is that Africa is probably not going to be able to solve its education challenges of quality with the rate of growth of the population. Yes, Albert, South Africa is low, and there are a couple other countries nearby that are low. But again, what I would say is there are even countries that are focused on this are having trouble achieving it because the unmet need for contraception is way too high. And you didn't have that in East Asia or South Asia. And also, the number of women having children before the age 18 is way too high. And that has a lot of negative impacts in the future. And I think that also needs to be focused on. And then regional engines. You know, Chile didn't need a regional engine. It had the US. Africa could have Europe. And I think that's where the focus could be. Africa could also have parts of Latin America that are doing well. And I think that's where the focus should be. And I think in your global value chains analysis of Africa, it'll be interesting to see how well that is working or not working and where that can go. I think that's enough for me. And I want to thank everybody for putting up with me on Skype or whatever, WebEx or whatever this is. It was really great fun to participate.
All right, thank you. So let me thank, I will be brief. Let me thank all the speakers.